Welcome to your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman. Jeff Fawcett and I come to you weekly with a critical, independent voice on the politics and practice of health and the environment. The research of today's guest and his team is altering the way we understand how pollutants affect our health and the health of our offspring, and possibly their offspring, and their offspring. Well, you get the idea. This means toxicants may be changing evolution if we don't extinct ourselves. This is a new idea. We expect DNA damage from various forms of radiation, which can be passed on. But we don't expect that without DNA damage, chemical assaults are also altering the genome. And needless to say, Dr. Michael Skinner isn't very popular with the chemical lobby. In fact, they have hired industry-paid experts to reproduce his results without his methods, which means they didn't reproduce his results, and that's supposed to disprove his results. It does not. Epigenetics is the science that explores how environmental exposures alter gene expression, what genes get turned on and off. Until now, it meant that what you inherited at birth can be altered by how you live and what your environment is like. It still means that with a new twist. Join us to explore groundbreaking research going on at Washington State University in the Skinner Laboratory. You may want to change your environment. First, a commentary by Dr. Jeffrey Fawcett.
Thank you, Lena. Aidan Fitchett has confirmed the results of a scientific experiment. Aidan is a second grader in Michigan. What Aidan confirmed is that radiofrequency radiation harms the germination and development of garden cress. Aidan repeated a similar experiment conducted by 9th grade Danish students. The experiments consisted of growing garden cress seeds in identical conditions, except that one batch was grown next to a wired computer, while another batch was grown next to a wireless router. In both experiments, the cress grown next to a wired computer did well. Next to the wireless router, the seeds failed to thrive. Aidan reported that, contrary to the spicy tang of the unexposed cress, the cress exposed to wireless technology had no taste at all. This is how science is supposed to work: independent confirmation of experimental results. How is it that Aidan decided to conduct this experiment? Aidan suffered from severe headaches when he was close to a wireless projector used in his classroom. His mother, Rachel, a biologist, immediately had Aidan moved away from the projector. When science fair time came around, Aidan, inspired by the Danish students, decided to do the garden cress experiment. What did Aidan conclude from his experiment? Quote, "The garden cress are living and growing just like me. The ones by the Wi-Fi were not healthy and looked crazy. Wireless devices must send something through the air that are not good for my body." End quote. That's a very reasonable thing to conclude. Eventually, Rachel removed Aidan from his computer class altogether because his headaches continued. Quote, "He's a very bright kid who excels in all subject. He doesn't need to get whatever it is they're getting in there." End quote. So clearly, Aidan's school did not draw the same conclusions from his experiment as Aidan and his mother. I think we should consider the power relations at work here and the many other radiofrequency radiation experiments being conducted involuntarily on children and adults. Based on Aidan's experiment, a reasonable person could conclude that exposure to non-ionizing radiofrequency radiation poses a health risk. That only one child reports a headache and associates it with exposure to a wireless device does not mean that other children are not experiencing other acute symptoms, nor does it mean that other children won't suffer from chronic health effects due to the same exposure. That's the radiation experiment being conducted in Aidan's former computer class. A multitude of similar radiation experiments are being conducted these days. One is the wireless exposure to which infants are subjected by their worried parents. Decked crib monitors are widely known as sources of radiofrequency radiation exposure. But more recently, parents are able to purchase a pacifier that monitors their child's temperature and transmits it to the parent's wireless tablet. This means that the baby doesn't just have a wireless radio monitor in the room for the night, but a wireless pacifier in his or her mouth. Of course, these aren't very good experiments, aside from the subjects being unwittingly enlisted. They're not very good because no one's really paying attention, because everyone knows that wireless technologies are safe, because no one's proven that they're not safe. Let me say again that a reasonable person could conclude that wireless exposures pose a health risk based on Aiden's experiment. But there are reasonable people who do take seriously the hypothesis that exposure to non-ionizing radiation can cause significant biological and health effects. A recently released 2007 document describes one collection of experiments conducted at the University of Nevada. Quote, "The research in this proposal was to sustain the progress and growth of ongoing research projects in which non-thermal radiofrequency microwave effects on skeletal muscle contraction and catecholamine release from chromaffin cells are being investigated. The overall goal of the research is to lay the foundation for developing non-lethal, stunning, immobilizing weaponry based on radiofrequency microwave radiation." End quote. The document was prepared for the U.S. Air Force and is a proposal to continue with research already completed. This is ongoing research. Aiden's school might not be interested in the health effects of non-ionizing, non-thermal, everyone knows it's safe radiation from everyday devices such as smartphones, tablets, computers with wireless connections, wireless routers, cell phone antennas and towers, Wi-Fi hotspots, wireless classroom projectors, wireless baby monitors, and Wi-Fi pacifiers. But the U.S. military is actively interested in the health effects of non-ionizing, non-thermal radiofrequency radiation. Catecholamines are precursors to stress hormones and neurotransmitters. So very broadly, this research is intended to develop a weapon that will immobilize enemy combatants by causing a severe stress response using a form of radiofrequency radiation commonly used in smartphones, etc. Do you think that a reasonable person could conclude that it causes a headache or other stress response? A transcript is available at yourownhealthandfitness.org. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. Take care of yourself.
Jeffrey Fawcett is a political economist, a writer, and he produces this show with me, and he is primary author of the book we wrote together, Too Much Medicine, Not Enough Health. Now to today's topic, which is epigenetics and evolution. And today's guest is Michael Skinner, Ph.D., spelled like it sounds, Skinner, whose family has deep roots in the Pacific Northwest. He grew up on a ranch and started college on a wrestling scholarship. After earning his Ph.D. in biochemistry, he built a solid reputation as a reproductive biologist, studying the molecular biology of testes and ovary development, and founding a center for reproductive biology at Washington State University with more than 100 faculty members. The Center for Reproductive Biology is one of the largest reproductive science research centers in the world. Dr. Skinner also established and was director of the Center for Integrated Biotechnology, established in 2002 with over 170 active research faculty members. In 2008, he stepped down as director of the centers to focus his efforts on research. His research has been highlighted in BBC, PBS, and Smithsonian documentaries and selected as one of the top 100 discoveries in 2005 and 2007 by Discover. In 2013, he received the American Ingenuity Award from the Smithsonian. And we're very grateful that you're joining us. Welcome to you, Dr. Skinner.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, a good place possibly to start is that although you've been probably circulating around these issues for a long time, A postdoc member of your team, Andrea Cupp, found something that changed your mind about how an insecticide might cause inherited damage. Can you explain what happened and why that's so significant?
Sure. Andrea Cupp, who's now a professor at Nebraska, she was a postdoc in the lab about 13 years ago, and we were doing studies to look at the effects of a pesticide and a fungicide used in agriculture on reproduction using a rat model. So we exposed a gestating pregnant female rat at a critical time of when your testis or your ovary develop in the fetus to see what would happen to the offspring. And what we found is, yes, the males from that exposure developed some testis defects where the developing sperm and the testis started to die off in pretty high levels. But then there was a serendipitous mistake. She accidentally bred the F1 generation, the children of that exposure, to make the second generation, sort of the grand offspring. And didn't expect to do that experiment because the exposure was only a transient period during the pregnant mother exposure. But we said, go ahead and go look at the characteristics of that offspring, and lo and behold, nearly 100% of the male population had this same testis defect. So that was a little difficult to explain. We did a whole series of studies and bred that lineage out for 4 generations, so the great-great-grand offspring. And continually we had, it was greater than 90% of the male population had, as they became adults, this abnormality. So this is called a transgenerational phenotype because of the frequency, and because at each generation we did not see a decline in the frequency. This cannot be a genetic phenomena which would follow normal genetic rules or Mendelian rules. So we had to look at an alternate mechanism, and that mechanism turned out to be epigenetics. So the compound, which I'll describe in a second, promoted this epigenetic change, and turns out the sperm, and it was passed from generation to generation for 4 generations, which is a very unique form of inheritance called a non-genetic form of inheritance.
So if you would please explain, you were going to mention more about the chemical itself, and also clearly this is not how epigenetic effects usually work.
So epigenetics is defined as sort of molecular factors around the DNA that can regulate how the DNA functions. In other words, which genes are turned on and off. And then what happens is that regulation is done completely independent of DNA sequence. So epigenetics does not require a specific sequence. Genetics generally requires a very specific sequence to function. So this is sort of a non-genetic phenomenon that's called epigenetics. And this phenomena turns out to be very stable. So when a parent cell divides into 2 daughter cells, the daughter cell has to replicate completely the parent cell's epigenome. And so therefore, as this cell continues to divide throughout life, it carries this altered epigenetics. Now, epigenetics, there's several different forms. The most common and first identified was called DNA methylation, where a small chemical group called a methyl group gets chemically attached to the DNA. By attaching that methyl group onto the DNA, you can actually influence how the gene is turned on or off. Another form is there's proteins around the DNA that help wrap it up, and if those proteins get chemically modified, that can change how the DNA functions as well as the structure of the DNA, whether it's coiled or looped. Those are also things that can change how genes are turned on and off. So all of those phenomena are called epigenetics. And so it turns out that what we have identified is that exposures such as nutrition or stress or chemicals can change at very critical stages of development the epigenetic programming of the DNA. And if it happens to be in a sperm or an egg, then this can be transferred from generation to generation. So this is a new form of inheritance which is very much goes against the concept that the only form of inheritance is genetic, which involves just the DNA sequence. So this is a different type of sort of phenomena on a molecular level that can regulate biology we really didn't pay attention to before.
Yeah, it's very significant. And let me just say, this is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman, Jeff Fawcett sitting by, and we're on the phone with Dr. Michael Skinner from his Center for Reproductive Biology, discussing new research showing that epigenetic changes from the environment can be inherited, which is very significant because we usually think of this sort of thing happening simplistically as an atom bomb gets dropped in the ocean, and a few generations beyond that, an enormous dinosaur that breathes fire comes crawling out of the ocean and stomps out Tokyo. And that's due to, well, that's a joke, but it is the case that we normally think of specifically ionizing, although we now know that non-ionizing or wireless technologies also alter DNA with a different mechanism. But when you have your DNA altered, that, can cause you to have some cancers. It causes these weird inherited effects. But to find out that there is another way for this to happen is getting you into some trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So it turns out, if you think about biology, every cell type in your body has exactly the same DNA and DNA sequence. So the reason a neuron is different from your heart cell, if it was simply based on sequence, is very difficult to explain. But it turns out that the epigenetic marks that are on those cells in the neuron versus the heart cell are completely different. So the reason there is a strong difference in what genes are turned on and off has to do with the epigenetics. So it's not surprising that epigenetics has a very significant impact on biology and physiology. The difference with most environmental chemicals, nutrition, stress, most environmental factors cannot change DNA sequence. The DNA sequence is very stable, very difficult to change. And as you just mentioned with the atom bomb, with radiation effects occur in very random spots. They're never in the same spot, and they're very, very low frequency events, less than 0.001% of a population. However, the environment can actually change the epigenetics very rapidly during development, such that it can affect 90% of the population. So what we look at and what we see in biology is very rapid changes in evolution, very major effects of environmental chemical exposures on disease, but it's very difficult to explain those phenomena with just genetics. By adding epigenetics to that mix, we can actually start to understand the mechanism by which environmental chemicals can influence us and our subsequent generations to come.
Yeah, and the naive or the rapacious among humans are thinking to themselves, well, it'll just cause us to adapt. We'll just evolve and we'll become more resistant to these things and we'll be able to handle it. And indeed, some things that are clearly causing epigenetic effects, and even, like I was mentioning, the whole wireless revolution thing, the problem with the non-ionizing radiation is that the studies that have been done on DNA damage indicate that the mechanism has to do with making it difficult or impossible for the DNA to repair itself. And that's pretty serious. That's pretty much cancer. Hi, hello, here it comes very rapidly now. And now we're seeing it in very young people. But there are people who believe that young people who are exposed to this early on may adapt to the technologies or these other exposures, and that it indeed might be okay. And instead, what I think we're seeing is, among other things, and you may know about this research, that that sperm motility and sperm production is dropping like a rock, and we're seeing already that fertility rates are dropping worldwide. So,
correct.
So we are seeing Oh, and the other thing I was going to say is that there are the people who say, yes, but you can kill cancer cells with electromagnetic radiation, or you can do other things with these magnificent pesticides and drugs. And to my mind, the fact that they have a biological effect means that you have to have a precautionary principle. And when I said you're not very popular right now, it means that, if this was really okay, people wouldn't be going after you, and they kind of are.
Well, there's a couple reasons for that. One is, for the past 100 years, the past 50 or 60 years, dramatically, but the past 100 years, there's a paradigm that has developed in science, and it's called genetic determinism. The concept is that the DNA sequence is the absolute building block for all of biology. It is very critical, but what we're finding is the DNA sequence is very important, but it's a piece of a much bigger story. And epigenetics may be equally important in regulating what's going on than the actual DNA sequence. So all of these people have had classes and for generations been taught that genetic determinism is the way biology works. Over time, however, there's lots of phenomena like the increase in disease frequencies, the fact that identical twins don't get the same diseases, they're different,
right,
even though they have the same genetics. There's lots of phenomena which we cannot explain with genetics. Turns out if you start thinking about epigenetics as being an equally important role, all of a sudden we have a mechanism to explain most of those phenomena. And the thing that's coming out is the environment plays a far more important role for biology than we thought before. And so this is why we get a lot of opposition to our research, because we're challenging that major paradigm. In addition, what we've done for toxicology is provided a mechanism by which chemicals can actually influence biology, which we didn't have before. Most of those chemicals really couldn't affect things genetically because they didn't promote mutations and things. So all of a sudden the industry is very concerned about what we do because we've provided a mechanism which will allow us to understand how these things affect us.
Yeah, there's an interesting article in Science about you, and it describes you as being fierce, wearing a Stetson and a long coat. So you're kind of the gunslinger of epigenetics, and maybe you can describe what happened when you published the results in Science in 2005 and then the clarification in 2010.
So what happened was, at first, everybody was very surprised at this concept of this non-genetic inheritance through this epigenetic mechanism. But within a year, then the industry started, and then some of the government agencies, particularly the EPA, started becoming very much in opposition of what we were doing. So the industry published a couple papers changing the methods in terms of what we did, and therefore they couldn't get repeatable sort of data. And there were some basically people involved in the EPA, they were involved in regulation and so forth, that were very, very vocal, that complained to the journal. And so they wanted a little bit of a clarification, so that's what that was all about. Yeah. Since then, this has sort of escalated. But in my opinion, there's no reason to sit here and argue about something like that. Our job as scientists is to do more science. So since that time, we have over 35, 40 publications in the area. We've published that many papers. We've examined the actions of 6 to 8 different environmental chemicals and shown the same phenomena. Everything from dioxin, pesticides, fungicides, hydrocarbons like that you find in diesel or jet fuel. All of these things promoted epigenetic transgenerational inheritance of disease. And so therefore, by showing that many studies with that many different chemicals, and then other laboratories have started to show in everything from plants to humans,
I was just going to ask.
all of these species have epigenetic transgenerational inheritance. So no longer really is the phenomena questioned. The question really is, what's the importance to evolutionary biology and disease etiology? So probably in 5 or 6 years, it'll sort of calm down. But what we've done is shifted the paradigm, and that always requires a certain level of controversy and opposition at the time.
Oh, I've got about five different questions tried to all come out of my mouth at the same time. Let me start here. Since this research is about genes being turned on and off, then obviously genes may try to compensate for these changes. And what is the implication of that? You know, like for instance, if you're a cancer patient, if people don't realize this, there are very targeted vitamins and substances, nutrients that you could call, or including things that turn on methylation and stuff, that can help to reverse on an epigenetic, you know, the changes that are happening.
Sure.
You know, so your body's trying to compensate, and part of what can be done from an epigenetic standpoint is to encourage genes that are protective to turn on, genes that are doing things you don't want to turn off. Okay, so
a way to you have to think about this in a biological sense. So the premise, our preamble will be this: it turns out early development, particularly in the fetal stage of pregnancy, but also postnatally right after birth and pubertally, when you're in puberty, there are organs that develop, organ systems that develop at those various times of development. Whenever an organ system or a cell population within that organ system is rapidly developing in its initial stages, is when there's a very rapid shift in these epigenetic marks to reach an adult stage, where you have an adult cell that has an adult function. Okay? So it turns out that those earlier developmental times are when you're far more sensitive to any kinds of environmental shifts of the epigenome. So if you were exposed at a specific time in the fetus, let's say sort of mid-gestation, you would affect your lung development, your heart development, your kidney, and so forth. You may not get a complete disease at that time, but you shifted it such that when you're an adult and you've got an adult stage and those cells have been shifted as an embryo, now you have an increased susceptibility to develop disease. When you're in puberty, for example, for a female, that's when your mammary gland starts to develop in early puberty, and then at the end of puberty, it's fully developed. Well, it turns out puberty is the most important exposure period, critical period for exposures for a mammary gland. So it turns out if you happen to be exposed to something like bisphenol A during early puberty for a female, or for the prostate for the male, which is also developing during puberty, then turns out there's a shift in the epigenome of that initial mammary epithelial cell that's developing. Okay, because that cell is stable its epigenome, so when it divides, it replicates its epigenome. 30 to 40 years later, when you have a susceptibility to develop breast cancer or prostate cancer, it still has that epigenetic shift. It still has a different set of genes turn on and off. That causes that increase in terms of disease susceptibility to develop breast cancer or prostate cancer. It didn't come from anything you were doing necessarily when you're 40s or 50s. It came from what was going on during puberty. So this early developmental origins of later life disease is a real thing, and it turns out epigenetics is one of the principal mechanisms that we think are involved in that. So when you think about something like developing cancer and developing a cancer treatment, the cause for that actually came from an earlier development.
Right. As
an adult, we are actually fairly resistant to environmental insults. That's a classic toxicology phenomenon we've known for years. If you take an adult, any kind of animal system, or a human, expose them, they're actually fairly resistant to those things. It was the earlier life thing that we needed to think about, which is something we don't really do today. We don't think about exposures to our children as being far more critical than exposures of adults. So as adults, those types of exposures can shift the balance as to whether you're going to get the disease or not, but the susceptibility was put in much earlier in life.
This is part of what makes me crazy when conventional medicine starts focusing on genes as predictive. Now everybody's getting their genes mapped out to find out what possible cancers they may get or heart disease, so they can start treating them now with drugs that suppress symptoms. So this makes me nuts. We need to take a very brief musical break. When we come back, why don't we take that up a bit, talk about, because when the drug companies get over and the chemical companies get over being mad at you, they're going to try to figure out how to use this to their benefit. So let's talk about that when we come back from break. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I am on the phone today with Dr. Michael Skinner, PhD, from the Center for Reproductive Biology, which is the largest reproductive sciences research center in the world. And we're discussing epigenetics and evolution, which is now a new coupling that's not existed before. So please stay with us for the rest of this interview. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman. We're doing a show today about epigenetics and evolution, which is not usually spoken of in the same sentence. We are speaking with Dr. Michael Skinner from the Center for Reproductive Biology at Washington State. Visit our website, yourownhealthandfitness.org, for information about this show and almost 700 other shows, free access to recordings as downloads, all of them, a free newsletter about upcoming shows, and more. Dr. Skinner, did you want to give people access to some of these articles or any place like that? Do you want us to link to a site?
Sure. The website for the laboratory is www.skinner, SKINNER, .wsu.edu, and under public or press you can get all sorts of information, and you can download publications as well.
Okay, well that'll be on our website as well, so people can get there and read this fascinating material. All right, so as I said, after the drug companies get finished wringing their hands, they're going to start salivating with glee when they figure out that this may open up, if you can use nutrients to turn on and turn off epigenetic things, you can turn the genes on and off, well, then it may come up options for things that might, instead of having a woman have both breasts removed or her uterus, because her family line has this. Incidentally, I just had a conversation with a client where I said, the problem here is that reproductive cancers will just pop up somewhere else in your body cavity. They're not going to just go away because you remove the target organ. That doesn't work that way. But anyway, so why don't you spin off on that if you have some thoughts?
Sure.
Cautions.
If I was to ask someone off the street where does disease come from, they will more than likely say from some genetic mutation that we inherited or that developed early in life. However, and because of that, and this concept of genetic determinism, the National Institute of Health for the past almost 10 years has performed studies called genome-wide association studies, where they've looked in literally thousands of patients with a specific disease for mutations in the DNA that would correlate with the disease. And they've done this with a dozen different diseases. In many of the diseases, like breast cancer or prostate cancer and so forth, they have found some mutations that correlate with the disease. The problem is, it's generally in less than 1% of the population with the disease. So it's a very low-frequency event. They're quite happy they have a correlation, but they really can't explain the other 99%. So it turns out epigenetics, what we can do is induce an epimutation, sort of an epigenetic shift in the DNA, what we call epimutation, early in life, and that will influence 90% of the population, where we have 90% of the, let's say, our female animals developing polycystic ovarian disease or testis abnormalities. Or recently we used DDT and promoted 50% of both males and females transgenerationally in the great-grandchildren to develop obesity. So these are very high-frequency events, and that's something that's been known for a while with epigenetic phenomena. So with that in mind, if we have epigenetic marks in the DNA that can diagnose early life exposure or your great-grandmother's exposure, that may influence your disease susceptibility. Potentially, we could use those in your early 20s to diagnose what's there, how it may influence then what you got exposed to it, or diagnose what you got exposed to early in life, or ancestrally. Then how is that epimutation signature correlated to disease later in life? That early stage diagnosis may allow us to do therapeutic treatment before the disease ever develops. That's called preventative medicine, and the reason we haven't done preventative medicine in the past is we had really good diagnostic markers for these things. Epigenetics may provide that. And so that's a major shift that we might find in the medical community and medical health that we didn't have before. And so I think epigenetics will provide a whole revolution. It's just right now we're still in that debate on how important genetics versus epigenetics is. And in my mind, the two are so intertwined, you really can't separate them.
So I'm going to give you my opinion for what it's worth, not being a expert as you are, but just to throw this out from my observations, being a sort of independent scholar. And I wish I could remember who this was, but somebody said that, genetics loads the gun and epigenetics pulls the trigger. So what this means is that people have, despite the fact that they may have been exposed, well, you can count on it. People have all been exposed to stuff of various types.
Today, right?
Yeah. Oh, baby boom. I'm a baby boomer, so going back to, DDT goes back to
the 50s.
Before even World War II, stuff like that. So this has been going on for a long time. So you may have a sense of what sorts of things, and then you've got choices, because you people can. Not as much today as we used to be able to, but to some extent you can make choices about your environmental exposures. And the environment also includes your psychosocial environment.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing, right? So the thing that it seems to me that this research points out is, one, what is public health's responsibility, since Europe and other places beyond many even developing nations have much stricter rules about what sorts of materials are allowed to be used. We're just frighteningly lax in terms of regulation on all of these things, all of it, and even the wireless and the chemicals, everything. In fact, Mark Shapiro, who wrote the book Exposures? Toxic? Anyway, great book. Can't remember the name right now. He points out that America, the United States, is one of the only places that lets in a whole bunch of chemicals. The other. So there's a public health responsibility here, and then there's the responsibility of each individual person to be realistic about the choices they make in terms of how they create their environment.
Mm-hmm. So
yeah.
Let me give you a preamble first, in the sense that there's a lot of people that want to point fingers as to where the problem comes from. And easily they point their fingers directly at industry and say it's your fault. Well, I'm a strong advocate to say it's everybody's fault. The reason we have a product being produced by an industry and we're using it to a large degree is demanded by the public. The public is just as much a concern here in terms of use of these chemicals.
I have to say something. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We're in the process of trying to build a house. We're finishing it, and we have been trying to get non-toxic materials. And in California, which has supposedly strict rules, we cannot get certain materials. Unless you are extremely wealthy, and you can buy old reclaimed, you cannot buy anything. There's very few materials available.
But I suspect the majority of the population, when they try to build a house, will do just the opposite.
Because
they will go for the least expensive product possible to build that house.
Because who can afford it? I can't afford the expensive stuff.
But what I'm trying to do is convey that, to a large degree, if nobody would buy these things, then the industry completely shifted away. And so it is everybody's responsibility here. And so that's just the preamble. Now, in terms of what we can do about it, we have hundreds of compounds that we are exposed to on a daily level, whether it's the phthalates from the plastics, the shampoo, the whole gambit, the makeup, everything. So there's really no major way we are going to eliminate that, even within 1 or 2 generations from our environment. But we can try to protect ourselves from those environmental exposures. One of the largest exposures we have is the water we drink, the water we take a shower or bath in. Our water supply is by far one of our biggest exposures. It's relatively easy to primarily only drink purified water. To put in a house inline filter, so you filter the water coming into your house.
Unless you live someplace where the water is fluoridated, then it becomes almost impossible. You have to use distilled.
There are now a series of filters you can use to pull most everything out. I just put this into my daughter's house, who lives in Indianapolis, because she's pregnant. And I wanted to make sure while she was pregnant, she didn't get exposed to any of the stuff that's in the water. You can also do the same thing for your foods. You're going to be very cautious about what kinds of foods, where they come from, and so forth, and clean your foods. So there are some major steps you can take to clean up what you are exposed to. Your nutrition and your water supply are probably your two biggest sources. Now, there's lots of other things that we can't really avoid, like when you're just driving in a car and so forth. But we can start to take those effects to try to minimize those exposures. And I think the general public can do that today if they understand that they're out there.
I'd like to hear what Dr. Fawcett has to say about this, being a political economist.
So, right, political economist. So, yes, the ordinary citizen and consumer has a role. However, it's a well-known phenomenon that, just as common sense would tell us, consumers and citizens do not have as a full-time job understanding everything that goes on in a specific industry, and given the vast array of products that we're faced with, the information gap between what a consumer knows and what an industry knows is vast. And in fact, I just blanked on his name, but there's a Nobel Prize winner who basically showed that that's the case. There is an effective imbalance. So the problem is indeed that, just as a practical fact, people buy poisonous stuff, to be really indelicate about it, and they buy it out of ignorance. And so there's a structural problem between what consumers know and what producers know. Producers really are focused on the bottom line. They may be very nice people and give to charity and are nice to their dog, but when it comes to it, they will do what is necessary to stay in business and to promote their products. So, yes, we have the ordinary consumer has a very important role, but it's the kind of role that we're on the air for, which is to educate people about what their environment is. And their environment isn't just their material environment, their physical environment, it's their social environment. When you walk into the store, what's happening to you? When you see that thing on TV, what's that process? It is not an easy thing to combat, as we know from many years of talking about these issues on the air, and repeatedly talking about these issues on the air. And I will agree with you that the consumer, we are involved, but I think we are less involved as consumers than we are as citizens, and that the answer is less product choice, consumer satisfaction, and much more political and sometimes actively political.
Yeah, it's very difficult because there's a lot of citizen action going on all over the place, increasingly. There's a huge resistance to wireless technologies because now with the addition of smartphones and smart meters, people are starting to get sick. We're seeing young people women carrying cell phones, smartphones in their bras, and developing very quickly very aggressive cancers in the shape of the phone in families with no genetic history of this. And these are really invasive cancers. So there's a lot of stuff that's being, released, and the regulation is, there's so much corporate capture that even with people hitting the streets and going to meetings to try to stop these things, and all the people who are fighting against GMOs, and all the people who are fighting against the fluoridation in the water, and on and on and on and on, and it's beginning to feel as though people just have to go off grid and do things the right way without, just be under the radar, and that's also very difficult to do. And it does put the onus of this on on people who are rich, which is very unfair, it seems to me. So, I'm glad that you're involved in research that may lead to more understanding of what materials. And I'm hoping some of them will be nutritive materials, things, and not just drugs, that will help to rebalance this gene expression. I mean, that's what some very, very, very forward-thinking cancer docs like Stanislav Brzezinski are working on, is how to turn these things around.
Right. I mean, on your topic of cancer and vitamins and things, there are ways to actually shift the epigenome and increase, let's say, this chemical modification of DNA called DNA methylation.
Exactly.
There's a donor for that called folate. Folate is a very common diet, and it's very important. And on some populations are deficient in folate, and thus that leads to diseases in those populations. And so by simply increasing that vitamin helps. But the problem is, with a lot of vitamins, if you look at your daily recommended dosage, and you start increasing it 200 or 300 fold, that actually becomes toxic.
Sometimes it does.
And so therefore, and folate's a very good example of that. If you take 200 or 300 times the folate level that you're supposed to, you can actually be more harmful. You're causing more harm than good.
Can. Well, you have to be. I'm sorry. So you have
to be cautious about the folate. But if you're a cancer patient, I would definitely take the normal daily balance of the folate, because it will be helpful for you.
Well, now you're actually walking into my territory, so I'm going to have at a little bit. Methylation is a fascinating topic. It's extremely complicated, and when you try to talk it, I've been mentored by an orthomolecular doc that goes all the way back to Linus Pauling days. And we've talked a lot about methylation. It isn't just folate unless you have a genetic variant called MTHFR that is on both sides of your family line. It's you have it heterozygous. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with not being able to metabolize. Now you don't have the reductase. Okay. But the problem with folic acid is that if you don't have cancer, it will protect you from cancer. If you take a small amount of it while you have cancer, that's okay. But if you are developing a cancer and you do what you just said, which is to overdose on it, and by an overdose is going to be slippery, because vitamins and minerals and all these supplements work on a dose-dependent way, depending on the person and what they've been through. But the other thing is that there are other things that drive methylation.
Sure. That's just the most common.
Yes. So all the B vitamins and trimethylglycine, which is has 3 methyl donors, B12. Now I'm learning that actually the hydroxycobalamin is the best form. But one interesting thing, too, that I've just discovered is that people who don't sulfate well, which means that they can't handle sulfur-containing substances like onions and garlic and various things, are sometimes people who can become over-methylated and need to sit, for instance. Very simplistically, they need more sun exposure, and they may need to back off on certain things and get, anyway. So there's a lot of nutritive rebalancing that can be done, but it isn't obvious, and the information, of course, is hard to. But I still feel, personally, politically, I feel that the onus of this is falling on our institutions that are supposed to be protecting us and that are selling out. So I just, maybe that's naive, but I feel that way. Yeah.
No, I mean, I would agree totally that our diets, our vitamin intake, and all those things could be improved to better balance our physiology for sure. And people still have to remember, though, that your fetus, your child, and your teenager are the ones that are probably more the target for those shifts.
Absolutely.
And as adults, we can certainly improve our health, but it's those early life things you need to be real careful about.
So what we're saying here is that the first thing to do that you're advocating is remove the exposures instead of looking for treatments later. Remove the exposures, especially
Correct.
with children, and that means
particularly if you're pregnant.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, and I would add to that wireless exposures when you're pregnant is not been shown in studies to be good. So there's all that, and then there's just so removing the exposures, really being realistic. And there's so many. It's like every aspect of your environment is no fragrances, no artificial fragrances, literally no insecticides, no on and on and on and on and on. The other thing that is worth thinking about here, and you may have something to say, is the significance of what happens when you combine toxicants instead of just a single toxicant. Now you have this synergistic effect of various ones. So
mixed compound exposures are far more effective and critical in actually promoting any kinds of these physiological effects. We don't know as much about that because it's very difficult to study. If you have 5 different compounds that may be a mixture, to figure out exactly what kind of effects they're going to get, those are very difficult studies. But yes, we're exposed to mixed compound exposures, and so even though we could do a lot of studies around that, it's something to think about. Probably more important right now for us is we've been taught that the dose is really the poison. So in other words, the higher the dose of something, the worse effects it has.
Sometimes it's lower
now
dose.
we actually know that a number of compounds, it's just the opposite.
Yes, exactly.
Is if you drop the concentrations way down, for example, for bisphenol A and a number of the plastic compounds, it's the lower doses, the really lower doses, below the actual environmental doses, that are far more harmful than the high doses. And so that old concept that it's all a dose curve and how high you go is not necessarily correct. And most of the compounds we've actually studied, it's the lower dose that's actually more harmful and causes more disease than the higher doses. So you need to be very careful, not just trying to avoid the high doses, but just the general exposure.
It's interesting. We're going to be interviewing Dr. Terry Collins. I don't know if you know his work at Carnegie Mellon, but he's a green chemistry guy, and they are trying to figure out how to produce materials that don't have endocrine disruptors. I mean, how does this all work? How do you stop producing things? And I note in your bio that you're involved in some biotechnology startups, so I'm almost afraid to ask what you do.
They're more pharmaceutical. Actually, right now we're more involved in an epigenetic diagnostic sort of situation, trying to use these epigenetic marks as diagnostics for ancestral exposures as well as future disease onset, so we can maybe move to a more preventative medicine situation.
Although if we destroy the planet and all the creatures on it through our behaviors, it won't make us happy to still be around watching that. So what about the planet?
It's definitely evolution because epigenetics and environment can actually shift the traits or characteristics of a species to give you a greater degree of what's called phenotypic variation in terms of different types of traits. That's a major element in natural selection in terms of how evolution occurs. So by the things we've put into the environment have essentially permanently shifted the evolutionary track of not only humans, but every animal and other species on the planet. So we have shifted our evolution in terms of the future. And so, and this is something we have to sort of deal with now. Hopefully we can survive all this, but the end result in terms of both humans and every other animal will be different than it would have been if we hadn't contaminated the planet.
So the human beings might be alive, but there might be the only other companion animals on the planet might be very large cockroaches.
Well, it actually may occur right quicker than you think.
Oh, no, I believe that.
In the 1950s, the obesity rate in the United States was about 3%. In the 1950s, for 10 years, we were exposed to exceedingly high levels of DDT, and there's probably not a person that was alive that wasn't exposed. We know now that DDT exposure of the fetus can actually promote, 3 generations later, a high level of obesity.
Obesogens.
Well, no, this is actually chemicals that actually shift the epigenome.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Permanently in the germline. And then that germline passes it from generation to generation. So today, we have a population that has about a 35% obesity rate, and it's growing. And we're 3 generations from that exposure. So it's probably to a large degree those ancestral exposures that put us in this high susceptibility to develop obesity. If that track continues, within probably 1 to 2 more generations, we will be more in the 60 to 70% range. If that's the case, our entire society has shifted evolutionarily to a very, very different situation than it was in less than 100 years. So our evolution has really been shifted fairly dramatically, and many animal systems have, by these environmental ancestral exposures. Now we have a mechanism that can explain why this is potentially occurring.
And to the same effect, this extraordinary decrease in fertility rates that seems to be connected
Correct.
to microwave is going to be interesting, because maybe there's a limiting factor. Maybe it only can go so far before we get caught in the net ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
You are a wonderful gunslinger for the planet and for human health, and I hope that you will continue to have a lookout for, I don't know how else to say this, like, because there are unintended consequences to everything you do, and if you start producing pharmaceuticals, I don't mean to scold. I have no right to scold you, but
no,
just
we do
caution.
diagnostics.
Yeah, well, okay, but if you think about it, and people come up with these drugs, and then the drugs have unintended consequences.
Sure.
It's just worth thinking about, even though you can't always predict, because the things you worry about are usually not the things that happen. Things happen that are completely different. So anyway, any last words? We've got a minute or so left. Any last things that you want to say to our audience before we let you go on to this amazing research?
The message to the audience is the science around biology is shifting. And so it used to be predominantly genetics, and we've all had genetics classes, even in high school and so forth. And now we're realizing that that's very critical and important, but it's just a piece of a much bigger story. And the epigenetics probably will be the other, at least equally important part of the story. And so we're going to see a pretty big shift both in the scientific community, and hopefully it will influence healthcare and medicine in the future.
And in the meantime, mind your own environment. Pay attention to what
That's very, particularly if you're pregnant.
Yeah, well, I mind it, even though I'm never going to be pregnant ever. So, all right, well, Dr. Michael Skinner, we will have the website to your wonderful Center for Reproductive Biology on our website, so people can read this research for themselves. Thank you for breaking through to this amazing discovery and rethinking all of this, and the bravery that it took to weather the storm. I'm very grateful to you. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us today. Visit our website, yourownhealthandfitness.org, for information about this show and almost 700 other shows, free access to recordings as downloads, all of them, a free newsletter about upcoming shows, and more. It's all at yourownhealthandfitness.org. Your Own Health and Fitness is produced by Lena Berman and Jeffrey Fawcett. Being informed not only protects your health and your environment, it protects your freedom.
You know it's coming, Election Day, November 6th, with the balance of power in Washington in question and supporters and opponents of the Trump administration counting on the outcome. There are also numerous California elected offices at stake and important ballot measures in many states on issues like reproductive rights, marijuana legalization, district reapportionment, and much more. Hi, I'm Larry Bensky, and I'll be returning to KPFA's airwaves with a new weekly program, Countdown 2018, every Friday at noon. We'll talk to people around the country about what's going on in their area, take your phone calls and emails live on the air, and hopefully add clarity to the complicated electoral picture. That's Countdown 2018 every Friday at noon on KPFA 94.1 FM and on the internet at kpfa.org. Join us.
No one can tell the story of hip-hop and recent black womanhood the way Joan Morgan tells it. Hard Knock Radio, KPFA, and Marcus Books are bringing that feminist, that fire-spitting high priestess to Oakland. That's right, the author of When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost and the smoking new book, She Begat This, 20 Years of the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Joan Morgan will be at the First Congregational Church of Oakland, 2501 Harrison Street on Thursday evening, August 30th at 7:30. There's free parking, wheelchair access at this KPFA event. This is Davey D letting you know that I'll be in conversation with Joan, so be there. Get tickets at brownpapertickets.com, Marcus Books, or other East Bay indie bookstores for August 30th, The Fire and the Honey of Joan Morgan. Don't miss it.
KPFA, KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online at kpfa.org.
The time is 2 o'clock. You're listening to KPFA. Please stay tuned for Exploration.